And it's recording.
Want to hear about my daddy?
Absolutely.
My daddy was Melvin Pixley, P-I-X-L-E-Y. He was from Advance, Missouri. And his father was George Washington Pixley. And he was a little bitty guy. I remember him. He had a real thick white mustache. And oh yeah, oh honey.
I didn't know.
I didn't know you had it like that.
I didn't know it wasn't. Anyway, yeah, okay, go ahead. Can't do any more harm than I've already done.
Yeah.
George Washington Pixley?
George Washington Pixley. He was a farmer, but he was a landowner too, which in those times, in probably the teens and the 20s,
Yes, 1910 and 1920s, yeah.
He had a big family, and there were all kinds of stories that went around about George Pixley. Mainly that he was always sickly. He was a little bitty guy. He walked around and told other people what to do and how to do it, but he didn't do a whole lot himself. With all these kids that he had, and several of them boys, he had them doing all the field work. And so they would get up at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and by the time the sun had come up, they were dressed and ready for school, even though school wasn't open yet. But they would go to the field with the horses, or actually there's mules pulling the plows, and would race just as hard as they could to get as many fields, as many rows done as they could before school. And then off in the distance they'd hear the bells start ringing at school. And at that point, well, they would drop the reins right there in the field and pick up their bucket for lunch that was already ready and out there, and race just as hard as they could to the school to get there on time. And they usually made it, or very shortly afterwards. It was just a little country school. But then after school, of course they ate their lunch at school from their bucket. Everybody took their own lunch. Usually it was a chunk of ham and some pretty hard biscuits by that time. They'd been baked that morning, but by the time they got around to eating them, they were kind of hard. And that was usually their lunch. But then they'd race home after school, running as hard as they could. And in the meantime, George Pixley had taken care of the mules and taken them to the barn and let them feed, and then he'd take them back to the field and hook them back up again just before the boys would get out of school. When they got back, well, they'd take up where they left off and continue their plowing of the fields. And they did this day in and day out, and they would work until sundown. Then they'd go in and usually have some more ham and biscuits and gravy and baked sweet potatoes and green beans out of the garden or out of a jar that had been where they'd been canned. And they really ate well, but they needed it as hard as they worked. But that was the way they got their schooling in. Of course, there wasn't any. I mean, there was no thought even of doing any homework because they was too tired. And they'd fall into bed and then wake up at 4 o'clock the next morning and start over again. And all this went on up until the time for harvesting. And when harvest time came, they were taken out of school entirely and did the important work, which was field work. And for that reason, every year they were taken out at the same time of the year. And so my dad could never graduate because he could never go to school during that time. It'd be about 2 months there that he couldn't go to school. And he never did graduate from the 8th grade. But he kept going to school anyway and taking the other stuff over and over again. And he was pretty good with numbers. But as far as the other subjects, he wasn't that great in. Except what he picked up in life, which was a lot. But this was his background. His daddy, George Pixley, did a lot of bargaining, trading of horses and mules and pigs, chickens, whatever. He bargained all the time, and he had a reputation of winning a lot. I mean, he would outguess the other people a lot of times, and he wasn't above lying either. But he was, for the most part, honest. There was a story that I heard from my daddy that his daddy, George Pixley, about once or twice a year, maybe 3 times a year, he would hop on the train and go to Mountain Grove, I think it was, in the middle, kind of in the middle of the state, and go over there and stay about a week. And during that week, he would go out to the farms from this little town and offer to buy up hogs at so much per pound. The only thing was, nobody had his scales. But they would decide on a price. And then he would guess at how much it would be altogether, just from what he thought they weighed. And the other guy would guess what he thought they'd weigh, which always was more. And they went by that price, whether or no, when they got back to town where they could actually weigh them. So his was a lot of guessing of weight on pigs. And he came out real good on that. And by the time he got them back to Advance, and he could sell them at a higher price still. Maybe even feed them out first and then sell them. But he made a little money that way. And he was not a godless man, but he had no church as such. He was he had a brother named Henry, and Henry settled in Saxton and had a whole lot of children there. And he got married several times. Actually, his wives would die off, and he'd get remarried and take in their children plus more of theirs, until it was quite a family. And they just went out in all directions. There are Pixleys in Oklahoma. There are Pixleys in a lot of them in Arkansas. Around what's the name of the town? It's kind of in the western part of the state, northwestern. I've been through the town, but there were a lot of Pixleys there.
Okay.
From the Henry side.
Okay.
So there's the George side and the Henry side. And I met my Uncle Henry once or twice, and I think he'd been in jail a time or two, too. And some of his kids had too. They weren't
real upstanding citizens.
No, they weren't real upstanding. Most of the cops knew them. But they weren't mean either. They weren't bad people. They just kind of got in trouble. And they'd spend their time and get them out, and usually went straight after that.
At least for a while.
Yeah. But there were quite a few in my dad's family. Mostly girls. But there were 3 boys.
So how many kids were in
I think there were 8.
Wow.
And all of them are dead now. All of them. I watched them die off. We used to have a pixley reunion where we try to bring all the cousins and uncles and aunts together and meet each other and all, well, at least once a year. And it went off real good for several years. We had people coming from California to that pixley picnic, as we called it, the cousins picnic. And it went off real good for a while. Betty Bell and I started that. And of course soon we had to hand it over to someone else because it was too much for us to handle. But it went on probably 6 or 7 years, wouldn't you say,
yeah, at least,
John?
Yeah, at least.
And gradually more and more people died in the older generations.
A lot of the young ones didn't.
And the young ones weren't that interested and weren't coming. So we just quit. We just quit a couple of years ago, actually.
And of course, this is 2007 at this point.
That's right. But we would have it about this time of year, or maybe in September. Just a while.